Well, before we start taping,
We're already taping.
are
But I can cut it for a second.
we? No, what the hell?
Yeah,
Let's just roll with it.
We're gonna roll with it.
I've got, yeah, let's roll with it.
Stand by.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
And
we will. Stand back there where that light hits you.
oh yeah.
There you go.
And I've come to the conclusion that people react to Mormonism emotionally. And they either love it or they don't. And I was one of those people who didn't. And it never really rang my bell. I remember being very proud at times of being a Mormon because of the history and the story. And I loved my ancestors across the plains. But I thought, who needs this church stuff? Church is boring. I could never stand sitting there and listening to these old bags of wind ramble on and tell us what we were doing wrong, and it just never did it for me. So if you made that emotional bond, it sticks with you a long time. And I have many very close, dear friends who were devout Mormons, and there's a big divide between us because I don't get it. I don't see what the appeal is. And to me, it's transparent. Of course it's malarkey. It's preposterous to think that the entire real history of ancient America is contained in a magic book translated by magic means that postulates that all the American Indians were descended from Hebrews who got in a boat in 600 BC and sailed across some ocean, it's not clear which one, and wound up someplace, probably in South America. But what a lot of hooey. We now have, go up and see the Maya exhibit at the Natural History Museum. We now have detailed histories of the what actually happened in Central America. And we know the names of their different rulers. And they're not Old Testament names. They're not Nephi, Lehi, and Nehi. They're American Indian names. And what the Book of Mormon represents is racism. It is the belief that Indians were too primitive and savage to ever build cities and temples and create great civilizations. Well, that's absolute crap, because there is only one race in this world, and that race is the human race. And if you think that aliens built the pyramids, you're out of your tree, because human beings built the pyramids. Human beings figured out how to solve the engineering problems. And we're very clever folks. We can be really nasty and ruthless, but we're very, very intelligent, and we're great engineers. And American Indians were able to create a variety of dynamic civilizations. And the notion that, no, it had to all be done by white people is what underlies the Book of Mormon story. And it is just one more example of what an Atlantic writer called thinking that Indians had to be Jews gone wild. Well, they weren't. They were people who had crossed the Bering Straits at the end of the Ice Age, if not earlier, and had come down, probably, I think maybe the coast, but we don't know. History is a mystery, and that's what I've loved about it. That's why I've had so much fun with my unprofitable career as a historian, because I'm able to come up with questions. The process of writing history is about coming up with the right questions. And the question is, for me, a core question is, what made the Mormons go west? Well, they were terrible neighbors. They kept getting run out of any place they settled down. And they would have been perfectly happy to stay in Missouri. And they had a really great con game going in Illinois, and they would have loved to stay there. But they couldn't keep from stealing. Now, how many of you ever heard of a narrative of the adventures and experience of Joseph H. Jackson in Nauvoo? Nobody.
A ripe audience.
Well, I have edited a version of this, and I gave it to my friend who is the best Nauvoo historian ever. His name is Joseph Johnston, S-T-U-N. And he has written the most hilarious, path-breaking book based on this narrative that I think will revolutionize Mormonism if he can ever finish the damn thing. But you can find this on Uncle Dale's Mormon website. If you search Joseph H. Jackson and narrative, you should wind up at Uncle Dale's site. But I had to get it transcribed, and I transcribed a lot of it. And my friend David Bigler gave me this, and it is one of 138 copies. It was very difficult to get in the age before the internet. And what this describes is the Nauvoo crime family. And what was the Joseph Smith family? They were a crime family. They were all about the money, and they were about separating their gullible neighbors from their money. And they were able to make a pretty prosperous living treasure hunting without ever finding a single doubloon, a single piece of treasure. Now, how did they do that? Because it was the perfect discipline to learn how to con people. And they would convince people. Joseph Smith was very good at this. He convinced people that he could actually see things with his magic rock. And even when he was dragged into court in 1826, he had some of his victims testify, oh yeah, he could really see stuff in that rock. But it was all a con game. And what was Mormonism about at first? Was it a visitation from God and Jesus? No. It was about the Golden Bible. This massive, big stack of golden plates, which would have weighed, 250 pounds at least, and probably more. And it was that treasure that people were upset about when Smith claimed that he'd actually gotten his hands on it. Well, he didn't. It was a total invention. He'd made it all up. And because he'd had such deep experience convincing people to believe what he told them, he was perfectly suited to be a prophet. But what does a con man need? What's our current president, who is every bit the Brigham Young of the 21st century?
Sheep.
What does he need? He needs somebody to confide in. It used to be this sap named Michael Cohen, but what's the good of running this great con game if you got to pretend to everybody that you're something you're not? Well, that's what Joseph Jackson, who was himself a pretty notorious con artist and gambler. He was a Mississippi River shyster. But he was able to appeal to Joseph Smith, and Smith found somebody he could confide in. And that's what he does in the narrative, The Adventures and Experience of Joseph H. Jackson. And I'm good friends with, the leading non-Mormon historians of Mormonism. And we're all Mormons, because once you are, it's hard to escape being one. But we're not believers. And we've come up with new interpretations of what's actually been going on for the last 180 years. And it is a con game. It's all about the money. And it still is. Do you think the brethren care about whether we call them Mormons or Latter-day Saints or the big juju? They don't care. They just want the money to keep rolling in. And boy, does it roll in. They've created an absolute monster of an American corporation. And in terms of the family, look at who still rules Mormonism. When I heard that Michael Quinn, who I consider a good friend, had written a book called Mormon Hierarchy, I was thinking he was actually writing a book called Mormon Aristocracy. And somebody needs to write that book, which is about who is Mormonism's ruling class. Well, they're all cousins. They're all intermarried to the point where they've got serious interbreeding problems. And you wind up not only with a bunch of interbred cousins, you wind up with the oldest guy on top. And what kind of a crackpot is Russell Nelson? Well, he's clearly settling old grudges, because he got slapped down by Gordon B. Hinckley, another con man, who was perfectly happy being a Mormon. And let me tell you, the Mormon Corporation can plead with the media to call them anything but Mormons forever, but they won't. When the guy before Hinckley announced that they didn't want to be called Mormons anymore, the New York Times ran an article, and it said, the headline was, "Mormons don't want to be called Mormons anymore." But that's what we are. And after Nelson goes to his great reward, which will probably be, he'll probably make it past the 100-year mark. because he's such a pernicious, selfish, clueless old bastard. But no man knows the hour, including the great prophet. But I won't miss him when he's gone. How about any of you? But they're laughable. And that is the best way to deal with them. Don't take them seriously. They have no authority. Anything that they want to claim to control your lives is preposterous, because they only have the power that you give them. And I quit giving them power when I refused to become a priest. I was tired of being called in to meet with the approved authority, the bishop, and being asked if I had sex with animals. I mean, I remember when he asked me that, I go,
Wait, that's real? Wait, what?
oh yeah. And not only me, but a whole bunch of guys in my generation. This is like the early 1960s.
Was that a big thing in the 60s? People having sex with animals?
It was in Idaho. I mean, I grew up not in a corporate church, but in a rural church. It was a farming church. It was, you could go up to the church office building, which was only the one on South Temple, and walk in and see an apostle. And now there are these self-important bureaucrats, and they never talk to anybody who's not part of the circle. They're completely insulated. And I miss the old rural religion that I grew up in. When I was a kid, I grew up in East Mill Creek, and I could walk down to my grandparents' house on 3380 South, and go past the Baldwin radio factory. Anybody here know about Nathaniel Baldwin? He was the guy who bankrolled fundamentalism. And he had a row of bungalows on Evergreen Avenue where he kept his polygamous wives. And if the church hadn't decided, Mark E. Peterson and a bunch of other Nazi religious officials, if they hadn't decided that they were going to persecute the polygamists, now that the Federals weren't doing it for them anymore, they never would have gotten any place. But Baldwin had the most popular radio and speakers in the 1920s. It's interesting who history remembers and who history forgets. But Baldwin was a real character. And he took his money. He was also gullible, as I must say many Latter-day Saints are. But he wound up being conned by some shysters and served time in prison for federal mail fraud, which he really didn't deserve. He was a nice guy. But he was still alive when I was a little kid, and I could walk by his houses, and I didn't know anything about this. He employed my grandfather and most everybody in East Mill Creek. And the Barlow family basically were the founding fathers of fundamentalism. And they got their money from Baldwin. And my grandfather was the bishop of the East Mill Creek ward for about 25 years. And my mother told me that he once got a telephone call from some of the Baldwins. And they said that they called and said their polygamous patriarch had died, and they wanted Bishop Bagley to come by and raise Father Barlow from the dead. And I don't know what my grandfather said, but I would bet it was something along these lines. Brother Barlow, the powers of the priesthood are great and mighty, but there are some things that even the priesthood can't do. And that's one of them. But anyway, I'd encourage you to join what I believe is a growing movement among the best historians of Mormonism. We're not Mormon historians, we're historians of Mormonism, which see it not so much as a new religious movement, but as a crime family. It's a big con game. And what I found when I abandoned Mormonism, probably before I was a teenager, was it was liberating. I felt it set me free. And reading Mark Twain's Letters from the Earth made me see the absurdities of fundamental, true Bible religion. And being freed from the nonsense that I believe is all religion gave me a new sense of liberty and identity and freedom. So here I am, and I regret that I've never considered myself a Mormon historian. I've been a Western historian. And what I loved about my heritage as a Mormon was its trails heritage. And most of my work is trail stuff. I set out initially to write a biography of Sam Brannan, who was California's first millionaire and brought the first shipload of American immigrants around Cape Horn in 1846 and sailed into San Francisco Bay in late July 1846, a year ahead of when Brigham Young got to Salt Lake. And Brannan was a complete scoundrel. He was an alcoholic, a womanizer, a ruthless capitalist. And as Joseph Smith III wrote in his autobiography, Samuel Brannan was either an inhabitant of my father's home or a frequent visitor there too. And I believe that what Brannan did was learn his techniques that made him a rich man, the richest man in California for a long time, by studying Joseph Smith. But I wound up doing one volume in the Kingdom in the West series, which we've got. I'm now finished. I still have to index volume 16 of Kingdom in the West, the Mormons and the American Frontier. And this is volume 12, Innocent Blood, which is probably the best book about the Mountain Meadows Massacre ever written. And at least I wrote it, so who am I to say? But I wrote it with Dave Bigler. And it's got the documents. It presents all sides of the case. And I don't have copies of the book I'll probably be remembered for, which is Blood of the Prophets. But if you just can't get enough of the biggest slaughter of white people in the American West from 1840 to 1870, then this is your cup of tea. And in terms of tradition, we have Playing with Shadows. Voices of Dissent in the Mormon West. And this has some really spectacular guys who defied Brigham Young in the theocracy. George Armstrong Hicks, who I consider one of the bravest men, probably the bravest man to ever live in southern Utah, because he defied John D. Lee. He wrote a letter to Brigham Young saying, "What is your position on the Mountain Meadows Massacre?" And Brigham Young wrote back, "What?" He said, "Why don't you find a short tree and a short rope and hang yourself." What a compassionate soul, eh? But he was also the only Republican in southern Utah for probably 20 years. But I'm always surprised at how much I'm impressed by how many good people were involved in Mormonism. I mean, really brave, heroic people. And they're our ancestors. They're the common people who were getting shaken down. And I think it's part of the reason that we still have a pretty dynamic, creative society. We can sure sing. we got great musical talent spread out throughout the state. But it wasn't the leaders. It wasn't the big bugs, as Charles Derry called them. It was the ordinary people. And it still is, for my money. But anyway, I've got all kinds of books and all kinds of prices. This is volume 7 of Kingdom in the West. Fort Limhi, The Mormon Adventure in Oregon Territory. And it is the best book on Indians in Idaho that has ever been written. And it's by my friend David L. Bigler. And it explains how the Utah War came to an end. It also has the best picture of a Mormon cowboy that was ever taken. That's Louis Shirtliff, one of whose descendants became a scandalous Utah attorney general, and unworthy of his noble ancestor. But what's he holding? He's holding a whip, because that was a tool cowboys used at the time. And David found his autobiography, and it has the most amazing love story. This is a documentary history that reads like a novel. And I was debating whether to offer them for $5 or $10 because I've got a lot of them, and I think instead you can, if you want one of these paperbacks, you can get them for whatever you want to donate. And I've got a box of them, so everybody take one home. And then next are my best books. This includes the second volume of my Story of the Oregon-California Trails. It's with golden visions bright before them, trails to the mining west, 1849 to 1852. I hope I can get the third volume done before I die, but it's a horse race. And if you want one volume that pretty much summarizes my legacy as a historian, it's South Pass. The subtitle, I came up with a very good subtitle, but the subtitle I picked was Gateway to a Continent. And it is about the conquest of the American West. And it's a hard story. And it has, it's my solution to the mystery of the hand carts. Why did Brigham Young order the rescuers who were saving the people he had lured into the middle of the Rocky Mountains to divert themselves and haul in his steam engine, his groceries, his books, his glass, his threshing machine. He'd already gotten a letter from A.O. Smoot, mayor of Salt Lake, who was running the wagon train, that it had all gotten wet anyway. But why did he insist on diverting those rescuers? Well, it wasn't the glass or the steam engine. It was the groceries. And what were groceries in the 1850s? Liquor and tobacco. And what did the old boss want more than anything else? He wanted money. And who did he try to blame it on? He tried to blame it on John Taylor, who had done everything he possibly could as a loyal servant of Mormonism to make Brigham Young's cockamamie evil scheme work. And Brigham picks Taylor to be his scapegoat and writes him a nasty letter. And what does Taylor say? Taylor says, "You know I did everything possible to make this scheme work. And you know I never would have put money above people's lives." Essentially saying, you did that. But I told this story yesterday to a group out in Walker Lane in Cottonwood. And one of the women came up afterwards, outraged that I'd insulted her family, because she says she's part of the Brigham Young clan through Brigham's sister Rhoda. And I was a little stunned, but I thought, well, I'm not in the business of making people happy. I see my job as telling what happened, being honest. And I told these dear ladies that I felt like I'd been lied to growing up, and they said, "Well, what was an example of a lie?" And I didn't really. I've got a terrible cold, and I'm sort of fat-headed at the moment, but I didn't think the immediate answer. Seer stones. And anybody remember being taught about seer stones growing up? Now we learn they're like magic cell phones. Well, they can't even stick with one cover story. It's preposterous. But I do believe what John Taylor put on the cover of the church's newspaper in New York, the Mormon. And what did the banner of the Mormon say? The banner said, "The truth is mighty and will prevail." Emblazon that on your hearts. The truth is mighty and will prevail. Thanks.
Can we ask questions?
Yeah.
Great. I'm kind of curious about the differences that you see between Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, and maybe as a thought experiment, what do you think? How might the Salt Lake Valley have been settled and been formed differently if Joseph Smith hadn't been killed and he's maybe been able to lead the saints into this place?
He couldn't have done it.
No?
Brigham Young was a real consummate prick, but he was the man for the job, and he was immensely ambitious, and he worked really hard with the pioneer camp. Oh, and that's the other book I've got is This is, oh, where is it? Yeah. This will tell you all about the Mormons' Great Western Measure. And I don't address that question of would Smith have done it, but Smith was actually heading west to escape justice when he was called back to get his ass shot. But but this book was suppressed. They wouldn't let Wallace Stegner see this journal. Isn't that nuts? The church, the brethren, because Bullock records what they said. And what did they say? They said, Brigham said, we're going to get the Indians. We're going to clean house on them fucking Americans. But what Bullock recorded is pretty important. And what the censors never understand how to hide stuff, because you can't. Every letter that Brigham Young wrote was sent to somebody, and there are copies of this stuff all over the place. And there were always federal officers in Utah looking at what was going on. And one of the things Brigham Young says as soon as they get to the valley is, if anybody comes in here and tries to give me orders, I'll hang them. So it was not designed to work. But what was your question again?
I'm just really trying to understand the difference in character and in leadership between Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. Joseph Smith was a charismatic figure who was obsessed with sex and money, but mostly sex. And he was a predator. He didn't care about anybody but himself, which I find really contemptible. But Brigham Young was every bit as ambitious. And he says in one of his discourses that he studied Joseph Smith's techniques throughout his whole life, or as long as Smith was alive. And what he learned was how to control and manipulate people. Yes.
How would you compare or contrast him with the industrial magnates of the time?
He was penny ante. The real robber barons were powerhouses. Although not really. They were all pretty lazy, fat. They were manipulators. They were crooks. And Brigham Young was a small-time crook. And he pretty much got shaken down by the railroad barons. But he did manage to fight back and became a minor railroad baron himself with the Utah Central and the Utah Northern and some others.
Had he had the financial wherewithal, do you think he would have been creating a state's pretty big. Or
he didn't create a state. He created a theocracy. And what he generated was opposition that kept it from becoming a state for 50 years. David Bigler did a great book called Forgotten Kingdom, Mormon Theocracy in the American West, 1847 to 1896. And it goes through how Brigham Young delayed Utah statehood from about 1850 until 1896, when the only thing that kept out the other territories, which were Hawaii and Alaska and New Mexico, was the fact that they were full of brown people. And the Mormons were the last white people to be admitted to the Union. So he didn't create a state, he delayed it.
This is kind of a two-part question. Piggybacking off Dan's, am I wrong in thinking that Brigham Young was opposed to polygamy earlier on?
No,
Before Joseph?
that's all horseshit.
Is it? Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Because I'm curious, if he was, then how did he end up with 55 wives half a century later?
Well, all these guys go through immense trauma adapting to polygamy before realizing God was behind it. They were horn dogs. They were young men. These guys weren't a bunch of doddering old bureaucrats and corporate lawyers. They were dynamic young men. When Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball came into the Valley in their middle 40s, they were the oldest members of the Pioneer Company. And it's easy to forget that Mormonism wasn't always about the oldest guy ruling. It was whoever was as Brigham Young said, probably, he either said to Orson Pratt, you guys obey me because I've got the biggest stick. I think he probably said, I've got the biggest dick. But we only have Thomas Bullock's minutes of that meeting. And what's the second question?
Well, that was kind of my second question was if he was opposed to it, how did he end up with 55 wives later down the road? But
it's all malarkey.
Yeah.
You know, the idea that these guys were all young and virile, and they'd all been tempted by their religious power. And they're like most preachers. You know, they're all about themselves and the sex and the money. I have a very low opinion of religion.
So, in your opinion, throughout the prophets of the church, when did it turn from the prophet himself knowing exactly what he was doing and manipulating people and this and that to believing themselves and continuing on their religion?
Well, human beings are complex, and you can believe several things at the same time. And Brigham Young was a genius at being able to believe contradictory notions at the same time. But he had to know what he was. He was a fake. And you see this, the imposter syndrome, playing pretty dramatically with both he and Joseph Smith. But they also felt, look at how successful I am. I'm a big deal. How do you think Russell Nelson believes he's communicating with Jesus, or whenever he gets some odd notion in the middle of the night that it's God talking to him? Because he's got all these people worshiping him. It's pretty perverse, really. Yeah.
I'm curious in your thoughts about how the sort of modern homogenization and blandness of Mormonism may have come from the trauma of sort of the overt crimes that were committed, or if that's a thing. That's something I feel like I got from some of your works, and I'm wondering if...
There's a sense of persecuted innocence, that the Mormons were badly abused. All human beings like to feel persecuted. I like to feel persecuted. And I've had the corporation of the president spend, I believe at least $20 million to refute Bagley at every turn. And so far they haven't gotten to first base. But I'm not persecuted. I'm an American. I'm a lucky guy. And there's a brilliant essay called Persecuted Innocence by Roger Launius, who is the best living Mormon historian. he's RLDS, but he was the historian of NASA. He's a big deal. And he did a wonderful blog on persecuted innocents. And the whole story of Christian persecution is probably manufactured. The Roman emperors didn't care if a bunch of crazy Middle Eastern sect-inspired poor people were refusing to sacrifice to them. But the idea that they were persecuted becomes fundamental to Christian belief. And they weren't. Who's going to bother? But Mormonism's, I don't see Mormonism's, I think what was traumatic about Mormonism's youth was the poverty. It was extremely hard to live in Utah. And with all the money concentrated in a nasty elite that wasn't going to share, that's the trauma.
I think I'm pretty sure I asked you this when I first met you. Out of the Second Great Awakening, why is it that all of the shit that was thrown at the wall, why is it that Mormonism stuck as the American religion out of all of that shit?
Because Joseph Smith was a clever bastard. And I think that he put together the one piece of writing he did in his life that was really brilliant was his first vision. It's completely fabricated. It wasn't written until 1838, but it tells a compelling human story. And he kept trying to become a writer, and he never got very good at it. But that first vision story of a poor, innocent young boy pleading with God to tell him about what's the true religion, and that works. But also, Mormonism tells people what they want to hear. You're going to live forever. You get your own planet. It's all Jake out there.
And on the first vision story, what's the history of how it changed? So it was originally, he saw a heavenly being, and then it was a...
No. No, it's all about the plates. It's all about the treasure. God and Jesus never enter into the picture till very late. And in fact, I've got a thesis that when Smith trots out his first vision story, all the apostles go, "We never heard this story before. What do you mean? We thought it was all about getting the Golden Bible." And that was the whole origins of Mormonism. So, and I think that a lot of these guys, like Parley P. Pratt, he damn near left the church over the first vision story. But what are they going to do? Once you get people that sucked into it, they're compromised. They got all these wives. And I think Brigham Young himself says he went to Joseph Smith once and he said, it occurred to me that if I marry all these different women, I'm going to be bound to Mormonism forever, aren't I? And Smith smiles and laughs. Yeah. Because you are.
What do you make of the stories of like Oliver Cowdery who leaves and then right before he, his death comes back to Utah?
I don't believe
And
him.
joins, yeah?
He didn't make it to Utah,
No?
and I don't think he would have. But what do I know? This is just my guess. And Cowdery was a conniver.
Yeah, what's his story?
He was, I don't know. He was a snake. He had to know there were no plates.
Yeah, oh yeah.
So, and okay, they're all in it for What?
The money.
The money! That's right! And still are.
What's your opinion of the origin of the Book of Mormon? Do you think Joseph Smith made it up whole cloth? Was it rip off Oliver Cowdery and Sidney Rigdon stole it from that other guy? Or?
No. I'm a follower of Rick Grunder, who did a magnificent chronicle of 2,000 pages. You can get it on the internet for like $10, called Mormon Parallels. And it shows the culture that Joseph Smith grew up in. And it was every issue and doctrine and controversy in the Book of Mormon is hashed out in those 2,000 pages. And Rick is just an absolutely delightful, honest, brilliant guy. And he's trustworthy because, you know, the thing about being a historian is you got to be trustworthy. And if you're a book dealer and you're selling big ticket items, you've got to be reliable and trustworthy. You know that. So,
I'm the book dealer in the room.
You think
Guys.
this guy's trustworthy?
well, he is on his book business. I know that. But he says
Give you guys my
it was in the air. Smith grew up in going to the local store, and they'd sit around and talk about where did all these great civilizations come from. It couldn't have been the savage, drunken Indians we see down by the pond. So it was all out there. There's not one source. There's not the Great War. It's about 1,000 sources.
But you think he was just riffing or he stuck his face in a hat and he just kind of like came up with it?
Yep. Well, and let's face it, it is not
That's the story I
literature.
heard.
It is not literature. It is among the most boring and tedious religious texts ever written.
Where did the
And it was pretty
racism
rough
part come from?
originally.
The what?
The racism part.
It was inherent in America. The Indians were treated with nothing but contempt. And
They were just Lamanites automatically in his mind, and
well, he made up Lamanites, but they were inferior. Because white people, white supremacy, white people are superior. That's just the way it works.
When did the endowment and the temple ceremony come into the narrative? Like, when was that revelation had, and what's its connection to?
Right after Joseph Smith became a 33rd degree Mason.
Okay, yeah.
yeah, that's the Masonic.
And there's a volume in, well,
It's like the exact same, basically.
So was he involved with Masonry before getting the church going, or was that kind of like
it's pretty
pretty
ambiguous.
muddy?
Hiram was,
Yeah.
and he knew. Who knows the story of Hiram Abiff? Hiram Abiff is one of the founders of Masonry, and the parallels between Abiff and Joseph Smith are stunning. And I first learned about it when I talked to the Jokers, who were an affiliate of the Masons, back in 1993 or so. And I'm reading about Hiram Abiff, and I'm going, this is the story of Mormonism. Because there's there are buried sacred treasures and golden records and the whole 9 yards. So it's very hard to sort out how much Mormonism comes right out of Mason. Well, a lot of it does. But whether Hiram Abiff was part of it is a tough question. One last question?
Did you grow up with siblings?
Yep.
Plenty.
I had 2 brothers and a sister. My claim to fame is I am Pat Bagley's older, uglier, dumber brother. And I'm so proud of my brother, who is a Utah treasure. If you
So
don't
you
agree
will.
with me,
Yeah.
if you don't agree with me, I'll fight you.
I'll take it on.
What about Emma?
Emma was in on it. Like William Law said, she knew everything that was going down. She knew there weren't any plates. Her father dressed down her husband, and her husband said, "Oh, I'll get a job. I'll do better." And he didn't. Well, the whole point was to avoid being a farmer. Being a farmer was hard work. And one thing all the Mormon prophets have been is lazy. Yes.
When do you remember realizing you wanted to be a historian?
When I read David Miller's essay on the Donner Party in the Salt Lake Tribune when I was 8 years old, and I found the article, but I knew from the time I was a kid that I wanted to write books, and here I am living on Social Security. But it's been a good life, and I'm luckier than I like to think. And I've been thinking lately about a Bob Dylan lyric from It's All Right, Ma. Men not busy being born or busy dying. And every day when I go to work, I learn something new. Because I'm always asking questions about history. But I've been in constant pain, probably from sitting on my ass all day long writing books. But I find that since I've been about 65, I've turned that corner. I'm not busy being born. I think I'm busy falling apart and getting ready to leave. But no man knows the hour.
Hey, Will, I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about some of the research you've been doing recently on the Mormons' relationship with the Native Americans.
Oh, God. Well,
You guys got an
I
hour?
mean, if you don't want to get into it,
no, I will. I've got volume 16 of Kingdom in the West is The Whites Want Everything. Indian Mormon narratives of the Great Basin, 1847 to 1877. And it is just, I spent 5 years working it out, finding examples of what Mormons said, American Indians said. And they are eloquent, they are honest, they are immensely human. And what the Mormons did to them was what America did to Indians and all people of color. American racism is the great disease of our nation. And it still is. How did we get a clown like the Donald? We got it because he made an unambiguous appeal to racism. And it works. But you reach a conclusion of a book. And I called my friend Logan Hebner, who did the best book on Utah Indians, which is called Southern Paiutes, A Portrait. And I called him up and I said, Logan, I've got to end this book. I can't end it on this complete note of despair. And he said, when I was interviewing the Paiutes, I would say, well, this is a grim story, but what's the hope? And he said the Paiute elders consistently told him, as long as our people have the land, they will survive. As long as our children can commune with the landscape, it will all endure. They may lose our language, they may lose their native religion, but the land will give it back. And because we have pushed people of color to the very edge of our society, when the great sham collapses, when the gilded illusions that we all enjoy so much, we are so rich. Very few Americans today understand how wealthy even the poorest of us are. But we are, and I'm among a generation, an unworthy generation, who has seen the best and the fattest times. But if you shut down the supermarkets for 2 weeks, it's over. And who is going to survive? It's the people on the edge. People are tough, and a lot of people will survive. But American Indians are being keyed to endure. And they will get everything they lost back. So that's my happy ending story.